If it's Wednesday, President Biden is moments away from touching down in Italy, where he's set to pitch America's G7 allies on more aid to Ukraine and a tougher stance against Russia as ceasefire talks stall again in the Middle East. Plus, the economy takes center stage as the White House touts a cooler than expected inflation report, and the Federal Reserve signals a move to lower borrowing costs for millions of Americans. And Republican candidates backed by former President Trump come out on top in last night's biggest contest, while the stage is set for a high-stakes race in battleground Nevada that could decide the control of the Senate this November. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ameshia. This hour, President Biden is set to land in Italy for this year's G7 summit. The trip comes as he juggles a number of foreign policy challenges, with wars in Ukraine and the Middle East threatening to define his presidency. This morning, the president left Washington hoping to rally the world's largest industrialized nations to find new ways to get more aid and more cash to Ukraine. The president is making his pitch as support for Ukraine, both in the U.S. and in Europe, appears to be waning. That could imperil Ukraine's ability to hold back Russian firepower. Here in the U.S., it took lawmakers more than 6 months to pass an emergency funding package due to partisan fighting. Meanwhile, significant gains by far-right parties in the European Union elections threaten to weaken support from Europe. Despite that, the White House appears optimistic about a major announcement by G7 leaders to seize frozen Russian assets to help fund the war. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced during a briefing on Air Force One that President Biden and President Zelensky will sign a bilateral security agreement tomorrow on the sidelines of the G7 summit.
If Vladimir Putin thinks that he can outlast the coalition supporting Ukraine, he's wrong. He just cannot wait us out, and this agreement will show our resolve and continued commitment.
But the president's foreign policy challenges don't end there. As fighting in Gaza continues, a revised ceasefire deal is once again mired in uncertainty because of new demands by Hamas. Today's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, questioned whether Hamas is negotiating in good faith.
Some of those are workable changes. Some, as I said, are not. I don't want to characterize it further, but, you know, at some point in a negotiation, and this has gone back and forth for a long time, you get to a point where if one side continues to change its demands, including making demands and insisting on changes for things that it already accepted, you have to question whether they're proceeding in good faith or not. The longer this goes on, the more people will suffer. And it's time for the haggling to stop and the ceasefire to start.
Meanwhile, a new UN report by an independent commission is further complicating diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. The report is accusing both Israel and Hamas of committing war crimes since the October 7th attack. And there have been more cross-border attacks in northern Israel, as the IDF says it killed a top Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is responding with a massive rocket barrage into Israel. Joining me now is our team of reporters. Matt Bradley is in Jerusalem. We'll hear from Richard Engel on the ground in Ukraine in just a moment. And Monica Alba is in Italy, where President Biden is set to land this hour. So thank you all for being here. Matt, I'm going to start with you. We heard what Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to say about Hamas's response. What more is Hamas saying today, and how are officials in Israel reacting?
Yeah, I mean, you could almost hear the exhaustion and the exasperation in Secretary Blinken's voice. This is a man who's been to the region 8 times in as many months trying to shore up a deal, and it's so close and yet still somehow elusive. But I want to kind of pick at what he was saying here, and Hamas did too. We heard from Tahir El-Nono, who's a senior Hamas official. He was speaking to Al Jazeera. He said, and he rejected essentially what Blinken had said, and said that Hamas's position has been entirely consistent the entire time. And actually, NBC News had gotten word about this last night, that the idea of Hamas is dispute. The things that they want to change in this proposal have to do with the timeline, specifically when Israel's forces will withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip, when the war will be completely over, a full and final ceasefire. Now, that is something that Hamas has said over and over again. They will not sign a deal to release the hostages until there is a full and final withdrawal of the Israelis, a full guarantee. Now, at the same time, we also know from the Prime Minister's office today here in Israel that the Prime Minister and his people are going to be huddling tonight to discuss this deal. So it's not entirely clear to me that that the Israelis are totally on board. Like Secretary Blinken said, that Israel has already acceded to the deal. This was baked into that Security Council resolution that passed almost unanimously a couple of days ago. It took for granted that Israel had already signed on to the deal, and it was Hamas that was the missing link. So it doesn't seem to me, and a lot of observers here, that Israel is totally on board, that Hamas is the only one that's delaying a deal. Yamish?
Well, as you talk about Hamas possibly delaying this deal, there's also reporting in the Wall Street Journal that the military leader of Hamas has said he believes the spiraling civilian death toll in Gaza would work in Hamas's favor. What more do we know about that, and what is his strategy there? I mean, it's heartbreaking to think about the fact that civilian death toll could be seen as helping them.
Well, and this is something we also heard from Tahir el-Nono in the same statement talking about what Blinken said. He said that he denied that Yahya Sinwar was, savoring the deaths of Palestinians, that it was part of his plan. He said, and other Hamas officials have since said, that that's absolutely not true, that the Palestinian leadership, the Hamas leadership, is trying to end the conflict, and they are not trying to extend the incredible suffering that the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip have been enduring for the past 8 months. So they denied that completely. This is something that I think when we're talking about this Wall Street Journal reporting, I spoke with some Hamas officials back in October in Beirut. They made some similar noises, saying that the fact is that the big benefit that they've gotten from this is putting the Palestinian cause back in the headlines and bringing supporters of the Palestinian cause out into the streets in places like Washington, New York, London, Paris. But at the same time, they're denying that there is any motive to try to extend the conflict and extend human suffering. That is something that they are saying is simply not the case.
Important reporting as we think about the human suffering this war has entailed. Thank you so much, Matt Bradley. Turning now to Ukraine, where Richard Engel filed this report.
Here in the city of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine and sometimes called the capital of the East, the security situation has improved dramatically over the last 2 weeks. And officials here, both military and civilian officials, say that the reason is because some of the American weapons and supplies have started finally to arrive in this area, and that they've been using them, and they've been using them to defend this city. They've been using them to launch new attacks against Russia, that it has slowed down Russia's offense. They also say a significant difference is that now they are authorized, it's still in limited cases, to use those weapons to carry out strikes inside Russia. And that has shifted the focus a bit from frontline cities in the east, some of them right on the front line, to Russian territory. And it has made Russia focus on defending its air bases and its radar stations instead of always being on the attack. But now Ukrainians are looking very much toward the G7 meetings. They're hopeful that they can free up some money, particularly billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets. President Biden wants to use some of these frozen Russian assets and give them to Ukraine by drawing loans off of these frozen Russian assets and using that excess money to help support this country. But there is not a consensus yet in Europe, not a consensus among the G7 partners as to whether or not they should do that, with some countries worrying that it sets a bad precedent, that if you start seizing Russian funds, holding them, using those assets one way or another to give the money to Ukraine, that the United States or European countries one day could find themselves in a similar situation where U.S. dollars or euros are frozen, and they worry about the stability of those two currencies as reserve currencies. So things are looking better here now that the weapons are arriving, and Ukrainians are looking toward the G7, but no agreements at this stage as to what Ukraine might expect to receive from that important summit.
And thank you to Richard Engel for that important reporting from Ukraine. And Monica, who of course is in Italy, I want to come to you now. I want to pick up where Richard left off here. President Biden and G7 leaders are set to discuss seizing frozen Russian assets during this meeting. How confident is the Biden administration that they can really get this done?
Well, they're hopeful that there will be very specific conversations about just how to do this, because as Richard indicated, there's broad agreement about trying to go this route, but there is little agreement about how exactly to do it, whether it's to use the money that would come from the interest on those assets, in effect trying to pay for what Ukraine would be taking out in the form of a loan, or if there's another way to do it. And again, there are countries that have concerns for several and particular reasons that want to hash those out. But tomorrow, President Biden will be side by side with Ukrainian President Zelensky, where he expects to continue to say that everything that the U.S. can do and help lead on that would assist Ukraine in getting more money to try to fund its defense against Russian aggression will be worth it. So that will be a major case that the president will try to make on the world stage as they try to nail down the details. And they are hopeful that they will be able to come out of this summit with some ideas of how to do that, though those details are certainly thorny.
Well, as you talk about the details in that meeting with Ukraine, the White House announced a security agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine. Do we know exactly what that entails?
So we know that this is something that has been negotiated bilaterally for months. It was something that the U.S. and Ukraine started discussing, but it was a bit held up when Congress was not supplying that additional funding that the White House was pushing for and when that was up in the air. But they have been working on it, and essentially it shores up a long-term commitment to Ukraine's security and defense cooperation. And it's interesting, Yamiche, because it's something that the White House says is being set up essentially to be something that Ukraine can draw on from now until potentially a next administration, depending on who the president may be and whether that may not be Joe Biden. And if that is Donald Trump, there are, of course, many questions that have been raised because of the former president's comments about NATO, about Ukraine, about who should be footing the bill for some of those expenses. And so this is kind of an attempt to shore that up for Ukraine and try to really define, the length of this, that there is no consideration that this could end quickly, that this could take so much longer. And this White House, this Biden administration wants to stress that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine. But we know that the political picture domestically back home could shift that. And so they're trying to do everything they can to help Ukraine, no matter what that outcome might end up being in November.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to think through there at that G7 summit. So thank you so much, Monica Alba. And now for all of this, including the changing politics in Europe, I'm joined by David Ignatius. He is a foreign affairs columnist at the Washington Post and an NBC News contributor. So I want to talk about the G7 in a moment. But first, I really want to get your reaction to this latest ceasefire deal and this back and forth that we're now seeing. Can mediators, you think, bridge the gap here, as Secretary Blinken has put it, or are we already seeing what could be the slow death of this deal?
So, Yamiche, there's a fundamental conflict in the deal. And it goes right to the question that Secretary Blinken is arguing about, in effect, with Hamas. Hamas wants a written guarantee that the war will end. It wants a timetable for clarifying exactly when that will be, and it wants a promise that Israeli troops will withdraw. Israeli officials say, and I don't just mean Prime Minister Netanyahu, but a broad range of Israeli officials, say that they will continue their efforts to demilitarize Hamas regardless, that is an ongoing requirement for Israel, and that Israel will stick with its stated mission of making sure that Hamas never controls Gaza again politically. So that's, I think, the fundamental conflict that's being argued over here. Hamas wants, in effect, a guarantee that it will emerge from its tunnels, still a military force, still able to govern, and Israel is absolutely opposed to that. And you can't really paper that over in the language of the kind of compromise the U.S. has been talking about. It's, as the U.S., all U.S. officials say, supported now by the UN Security Council, it's essential to end this war. It's just caused terrible suffering for the Palestinian civilians after causing a nightmare for Israel on October 7. But how to do that remains elusive. The U.S. and Israel are both exploring different ways to provide a transition in which you would de-escalate, slow the level of fighting, reduce civilian casualties, provide humanitarian assistance, even if there isn't a formal deal. But I do think the gap here that surfaced with Hamas's response is a real one. It won't easily be solved.
Yeah, definitely will not be easily solved. Thank you for breaking that down there. I want to also now, of course, turn to the G7 meeting. President Biden is again requesting cash for Ukraine. As we heard from our reporters, the route here is to go through or to use frozen Russian assets. Is that really a viable plan? And is it really enough?
So seizing the assets themselves, taking the money that was frozen initially, taking the principal, is not viable. There would not be support from European countries. There's a lot of doubt in the U.S. about it as well. What it is probably viable is a way of using that principle to collateralize loans, using the interest in some way to assist Ukraine. It does seem to me that there's probably a consensus for that more limited measure. I think the real point that President Biden and his team want to stress at the G7 summit is continuity of Western assistance. First of all, continuity of U.S. aid. As Monica said earlier in her report, even if President Biden isn't reelected in November, this security agreement promises a security relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine going forward regardless. It's, in a way, a substitute for now for NATO membership for Ukraine. It's a way of guaranteeing security without that formal treaty requirement. I think they'll get strong G7 support for this idea. Yeah. Whether there's additional money, hard to say. I think probably there will be.
Yeah. And the holdup, as you talk about sort of the money that's being requested here, the holdup in the U.S. for aid to Ukraine has mostly been driven by the political right in this country. Now we're seeing gains by the European right after elections this weekend. Given the global politics here, do you expect this increase in Ukrainian fatigue and fatigue of helping Ukraine to really spread and to grow here?
So, Ameshia, it's just my personal opinion. I think, although there is fatigue in Europe as there is and was in the U.S., in the end, the commitment to Ukraine, the recognition of the threat that Putin and Russia pose to Europe as a whole is strong enough that I don't see far right or pro-Russian sentiment overcoming that. Quite the opposite. Talking with European officials this week, what I heard was discussion of polling that shows that among younger Europeans, younger French and Germans, there's actually strong, maybe stronger support for continuing to support Ukraine, resisting Russia, than among older ones. So I don't see a collapse in support, and whatever the right gains, it's not going to be strong enough that, in my view, Europe will suddenly turn soft on Putin and pro-Russia.
Mm. And it's also a tough time for European incumbents. Both France and the UK have called for new elections. What does that mean for Biden as he appeals to world leaders?
Well, it's a tough time for incumbents around the world, whether you're Prime Minister Modi in India, just go around the world and you'll see in almost every country where there have been elections recently, the incumbents have struggled. There's dissatisfaction. Polling shows a kind of global dissatisfaction with the personalities and parties that are running things. It's something that President Biden has to cope with. We're in a period, I think, where we're seeing political redefinition around the world. I think in the global South, the promises that the United States and Europe have made about a rules-based order increasingly are viewed with skepticism. People who I talk to from the global South countries say, you set these rules, but when you decide you want to violate them, you do. So I think there's a danger here that people will increasingly feel that this is a system that has some hypocrisy baked into it.
Yeah. Well, a lot to talk about the global politics here. Thank you so much, David Ignatius from the Washington Post.
Thanks for having me.
And coming up, new signs of progress in the Biden administration's fight against soaring costs as the Biden campaign struggles with voters on the issue. And the battle between Republicans and Attorney General Merrick Garland intensifies. The House is poised to vote to hold him in contempt just moments from now. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to the top issues facing voters, inflation and the cost of living. After months of rising prices, new data from the Labor Department suggests inflation may finally be showing signs of easing further. Consumer prices rose 3.3% last month compared to May of last year. On a monthly basis, prices were unchanged, breaking a near 2-year string of prices going up every month. It was welcome news on Wall Street and at the Federal Reserve, where Fed Chair Jerome Powell signaled that the central bank could cut rates later this year.
We want to gain further confidence. Certainly, more good inflation readings will help with that. I'm not going to be specific about how many because, really it's going to be not just the inflation readings, it's going to be the totality of the data. We see today's report as progress and as, building confidence, but we don't see ourselves as having the confidence that would warrant, beginning to loosen policy at this time.
Inflation has gone up more than 19% during President Biden's time in office, while wages have risen just 16%. President Biden touted today's inflation report in a statement saying, quote, core inflation at its lowest level since April 2021. Grocery prices have fallen for 4 months in a row, and gas prices are below $3.50 on average across the country. Wages are rising faster than prices, and unemployment has remained at or below 4% for the longest stretch in 50 years. NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans joins me now. So, Christine, thanks for being here. Here's part of the Fed statement from today. It said, quote, the committee does not expect it will be appropriate to reduce the target range until it has gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. Now, inflation hasn't been 2% since early 2021. Why should we have any confidence that the Fed will cut interest rates at this year at all?
Well, in fact, at the beginning of this year, the going conventional wisdom was there would be 3 rate cuts potentially by the end of this year. And now the Fed is penciling in only 1, and that's not really guaranteed. I mean, the Fed chief was very, very clear. They need to see and be convinced that inflation is under control and going in the right direction. So they're really balancing here. It's a real balancing act for the Fed, and they're going to keep rates here higher for longer to make sure they've got it right on inflation.
Well, I also want to ask you about the long-term outlook here. When will we have a better sense of whether inflation is subsiding in the long term?
I think they were pleasantly surprised. The Fed chief hinted that they were pleasantly surprised with today's inflation report. So that would suggest that would be more more ammunition that the Fed could start to cut rates maybe later this year. But there are a lot of uncertainties here. You cut rates when an economy needs a little bit of juice. You cut rates when things are flagging in an economy. And Yamish, this is a really strong economy. Yesterday, the World Bank called it exceptional and significantly stronger than the rest of the world, sort of the dynamism of the American economy holding up the rest of the world. So there's that interesting moment where the overall economy is still really pretty good. And so the Fed doesn't want to be cutting interest rates into a strong economy because then that will make inflation come back.
It's interesting to hear you say the economy's doing really well, because I talk to voters all the time and they don't feel that way. They don't feel that way in their personal lives, because even with today's news, you have things like housing costs continuing to be a main driver of overall inflation. Things like medical care costs have risen at least slightly more than in May than they were in April. How are living costs impacting Americans here?
I think you make a very good point, and I've been traveling to swing states as well, talking to voters, and even voters who say, my economy is fine, I'm doing well, but I'm worried about the economy for the rest of the country. And the problem, I think inflation is a word that we've used so much the last couple of years. Affordability is the problem. They see that their home insurance rates are up, 20% over the past few years. If they're even getting homeowners insurance, some policies, smaller companies are dropping policies. Car insurance and car affordability has been a real problem over the past few years as well, and shelter. That is the part of the inflation story that's really been difficult to dislodge. A lot of very smart economists have said that they can see in the data that eventually these shelter costs will start to come down, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, hasn't happened yet, and affordability is the key word here.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Christine Romans. And up next, consumer prices, crime rates, and the campaign trail. We're digging deeper into the state of the race and the top issues for voters. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. And it's not just the improving economic numbers that are boosting spirits in Biden world. New statistics from the FBI show a major drop in crime in the first quarter of this year. Overall, the violent crime rate went down by 15% compared to the same time last year. Property crime also decreased by 15%, and the murder rate fell by 26%. President Biden celebrated the drop in violent crime at an event yesterday.
You know, the year before I came to the presidency, the murder rate was the highest increase on record. Last year, we saw the largest decrease of murder in history of America. And those rates are continuing to fall faster than ever.
While the FBI data says crime is down, Republicans are continuing to hammer Democrats on this issue. Today, the Trump campaign put out a statement claiming without evidence that the FBI crime rate data is bogus. Trump continues to raise the issue of crime on the campaign trail. Joining me now on set is Cillizza. He is the founder of the So What newsletter on Substack and a senior advisor at Denton's Global Advisors. Also with me, Ameshia, a Democratic strategist and former Obama campaign advisor, and Republican strategist Lance Trover. So thank you all for being here. Chris, I want to start with you. Sure. Inflation and crime sort of have the same thing in common. They're going up on paper, but people actually don't feel good about them. So I wonder, why do you think that is? Why do you think that what's on paper is not going and connecting with people's lived experiences?
Okay, so I think inflation, I would separate them a little, though you're exactly right, Yamiche, that sort of perception and reality seem to be disconnected. With inflation, I think, look, the average person is not like, what's the GDP today? I wonder what CPI says. Like, nobody, I mean, like, I get my economist friends out there who think that, like, that's critically important, and it is as a leading indicator. The average person is like, why does bread cost this much? Why does bacon cost this much? The Donald Trump one. Why do eggs cost this much? Right? So I get that. Your lived life feels different than all of these, like, leading indicators that have no connection in your life. On crime, I just think that for a lot of Republicans, Donald Trump has spent the last 9 years, I was just trying to think between 2024 and 2015, presenting this country as sort of a crime-ridden hellhole, right? I mean, remember his inauguration speech was like very dark about America. And so I just think they buy into that. There's just a lot of people who buy into that logic because, candidly, on another network that I won't name, they often take an event that is a violent crime and it is horrible, is absolutely horrible for the people that it happens to and for all of us. We shouldn't have that. And they blow it up as though this is a thing that is happening. I mean, the unfortunate reality of our country is the violent crime numbers are down. There are still violent crimes in this country. So if you highlight them, I think people focus on them. But I think the numbers are ultimately sort of the numbers.
Well, talking about highlighting them, I want to put up, Lance, for you in particular, a part of Donald Trump's interview with Time magazine. When he was asked about the crime rate, he said this: "I don't believe it. They're fake numbers. The FBI fudged the numbers and other people fudged numbers. There was no way that crime went down over the last year." I mean, Lance, the numbers are not, there's no evidence that the numbers were fudged. This is the FBI here. But when you think about this, people not believing the numbers, there's that perception issue here. What do you make of what Trump is doing here and people's sort of perception of all of this?
Well, I would say tell it to the people in Navy Yard who had a shooting just this morning. I lived a half a block where one is. I mean, there is a lot of crime in this country. And even in the NBC News report last night, they talked about murders were up in L.A., in Baton Rouge, and Orlando. So it's not like there is a low amount of crime. And I'm going to tell you, if the Democrats want to keep going out and telling the voters, oh, hey, guess what? Crime really isn't that bad. If you've been experiencing it and that's how you feel, that's not a really smart
political move. But that's not the Democrats saying that, right? That's the FBI, and now you have a Republican front runner. Well, him saying the numbers that the FBI are putting out, that they're wrong.
Well, the numbers are what the numbers are, but clearly voters feel much differently, and I don't think it's just completely because of Donald Trump and Republicans. I think a lot of people are dealing with crime. They're certainly dealing with it in cities. So if Democrats' play is to go out and say, oh, crime isn't really that bad, as the Democrats were doing, that's a really risky political strategy going into November.
And Ameshia, how are these numbers being viewed in Biden world here? Both, I would say, on the economy and really on crime.
It's a messaging game for them. The economy, we have not been in a recession, despite what many Americans feel. The perception game is ruling supreme over actual facts, over actual data. And I think that it matters to talk about affordability. Because you don't feel as though, or because you can't afford things now that you could afford 3 or 4 years ago, does not mean that we are in a recession. Obviously, wages have not outpaced the cost of living. And unfortunately, that happens to be the case across this country. But I think that for the crime stats, it is very important to recognize that Donald Trump and the Republican Party have made crime their major issue, and they have run on crime since his first election campaign and has been consistent with it. And if you deliver a message like that over and over and over again, and every time there is an incident, you jump on it, and all networks tend to repeat what he said, even if it's just to highlight it as a newsworthy topic, it begins to seep into the American consciousness. In every major city that the Republican Party has pointed out as one that has a mass amount of violent crime. I'm a native of Chicago. It has gone down significantly. So I do think that we have to talk about it. We have to frame it in a way that does not ignore the instances of crime that still exist. I'm not saying, say that crime doesn't exist at all, but it has gone down. And there have been some pretty seismic investments to ensure that that happens. And many of them have been done under Democratic leadership.
Can I just want to pick up on that point about messaging? Because I think it's easy to run down Donald Trump, and he says and does lots of things that I think are, I don't want to say crazy, but not politically conventional. The one thing I think he actually does quite well is message, right? Every speech, like if I had to say, okay, what is Donald Trump running on? Immigration. Immigration's out of control. Now, again, we can quibble with I think he exaggerates facts at a minimum, but immigration, crime, and Biden's too old and ineffective. What's Joe Biden running on? Like, let's just put it on a bumper sticker. What's the Joe Biden message? And candidly, I've thought a fair amount about this. I mean, sort of more of the same. Like, I've done pretty well. Like, the problem is, I think the message Joe Biden would want it to be is, I've done more than you give me credit for. But that's a terrible message. Like, you people don't realize how much I've done for you. That message doesn't work, right? Yeah. But I do think that the Trump message is easily digestible. And it's been a long time of him saying this. Some people just sort of take it in, whether by osmosis, whether they believe it or not.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, if you're going to go out and tell voters that if they feel crime is out of control, if they feel that cost of living and affordability are out of control, and your message is to go say, oh, things aren't really that bad, yeah. or prices only went up 3% last month as opposed to the 20% over the last 3 months, that's not a message you really want to take into November.
And this is really about, to all of your points, how people feel. Even if the crime has gone down, you walk out and you don't feel safe, it's not going to be good. If the prices have gone down, but you feel like your budget is too tight, then it's going to go down. I want to point out that the Washington Post editorial board last month said this: it's possible that Americans are experiencing the economic equivalent of a hangover. It's taking a long it's taking a long time for the economy to get back to normal after the severe shock of the pandemic and the inflation surge. Ameshia, what do you make of that? And is Biden really dealing with an economic hangover here?
I think that we need to quit comparing ourselves and our economy to Europe, because if you talk to the single mom who's trying to feed her kids or keep up with utility costs and things like that, her concern isn't how Europeans are doing. Her concern is how I'm going to be able to take care of my family. I think that we have to break down top brass and talk to the individuals where they are, meet them where they are, in addition to reaching out to and having local leadership speak as well, because in many cases, these are local policy issues. So housing, for instance, that is something that, yes, we need more affordable housing. States and local governments are working towards that, many of which Joe Biden has met with and shared those concerns and had those conversations as well. We need to also amplify those voices.
Yeah. And Lance, as we think about sort of the messaging here, Trump's going to be on Capitol Hill tomorrow. I wonder, what's the Republican plan for inflation as you've heard it?
Well, I think the first thing there, it seems to me, and you talk to a lot of folks, I mean, the idea of the tax cuts expiring is going to be a big issue. I mean, Democrats are saying that could contribute to inflation, but I think what Republicans are going to say the last thing we need to do is raise taxes and when people are having affordability issues. But I see tomorrow as kind of a unification effort by the president and bringing all of them together, really, at the end of the day. And it's signaling that, hey, everybody's together. They're with him 110% all the way. That's what I see it tomorrow as.
And Chris, what's interesting here, when you talk to voters, as we all are doing, there's this thing that voters are sort of really holding President Biden accountable for the economy, and they're not really saying Donald Trump had a terrible, it was a terrible time under him because of what happened under the pandemic. What do you make of that?
So when my wife had our first child, it was, I'm going to get to the point, I promise. This is not a long story about my wife's pregnancy. When my wife had our first child, it was like incredibly stressful and nerve-wracking and painful for her and really difficult. And then like 3 years later, she was like, maybe we should have another kid. And I was like, seriously? You want to go through that? I kind of think that's what the economy is like for people. They kind of remember the good stuff. Because now you got like a 2.5-year-old. He's super cute. He's funny. You're like, kids are great. I think that's kind of how people feel about the economy. They kind of remember the good stuff, and they don't really remember the bad stuff. And I think that's what's really hard for Biden, because elections are ultimately really about the future, right? I mean, we can talk, it's cliche but true. You can talk about the past, but really people want to know, what are you going to do going forward?
They're not holding enough of the business community accountable, because we know that a lot of these rising costs were due to corporate greed, period. Senator Warren has been the strongest vocal advocate for, holding these businesses accountable. And we're seeing now that there are the retail industry, in addition to restaurants, that are right-sizing their prices. That is something that is going to be under control. But I don't think that's happening fast enough for many Americans who've been paying absorbent, costs for months or years at this point.
And that's back to the message thing. Well, I mean, how you frame stuff is super important. If it's, well, yeah, things were good under the Trump economy, but now things are getting better under the Biden economy.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about this for a long time, but we have to go. I will say, I still remember how stressful it was my first child, so we're going to keep that right there. Holding. But thank you so much, Chris, Ameshia, and Lance. Definitely one in holding at this point. And after the break, we're breaking down the results from last night's primaries, what they mean for November and the Republican Party. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. If it's Wednesday, somebody voted somewhere yesterday. And across the country, we got more evidence of former President Donald Trump's influence inside the Republican primary. South Carolina Republicans Nancy Mace and William Timmons both survived primary challenges helped by endorsements from the former president. Mace was facing a challenge backed by former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy that failed to get traction. Elsewhere, Congressman Kelly Armstrong, Trump's preferred candidate, won in the North Dakota gubernatorial primary. Armstrong beat the state's lieutenant governor, who had the backing of outgoing Governor Doug Burgum. And Sam Brown, who was endorsed by both the Republican establishment and Trump, won the Nevada Republican Senate primary. That win sets up a blockbuster matchup with incumbent Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen. Joining me now to break down these results and more is NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd. So, Chuck, thank you, as always, for being here. So these Republican primaries featuring Trump endorsements aren't really the ideological showdowns. We don't have sort of the establishment Republican going up against the Trump Republican anymore. They're sort of whoever Trump likes best gets the endorsement, but they're both kind of Trumpy. What's the significance of that?
Well, it's interesting. Mark Murray and I were discussing this, how the Republican Party feels like it's sort of in three parts, right? About half the party's MAGA. They're not just for Trump, they're really into the Trump movement and all that. And then you have the other half of the party that's kind of divided. You have about a quarter of them that are never-Trumpers or flirting with never-Trumping, and they don't like this. This is your Romney wing. Maybe you put Mitch McConnell in here at times. And then you have this other quarter that is they're not big fans of Trump, but they're always going to be a Republican. Yeah. And look, if half the party is Trump and then another quarter of the party is comfortable with him, I think that's why you're not seeing, nobody wants to, in these lower turnout primaries, you're not going to win an ideological fight that is somehow not MAGA. So I do think it is interesting that you don't have to be in MAGA to survive if you can get the Trump endorsement.
Well, there's that, of course.
Because I don't see Kelly Armstrong, some of these other people, they're not very MAGA, But, you know, ditto and Nancy Mace, you don't know what she is on any given day.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to pretend. I know where she is in the Republican spectrum these days.
Well, to your point, the Trump endorsement has still a lot of power here. So what's your takeaway from last night?
Look, that's still the game in the party. And I think the question we all have is, what does that mean after he's gone? I mean, he is seen as the vote driver for the base. He is seen. And, you know, what's interesting is how much, think about where we were 4 years ago and even 8 years ago, where you had down-ballot Republicans the ones that were going to be in competitive general elections, trying to do a dance with Trump. Now, you know, kind of wanting help where they thought they needed, but also a little bit of distance. You're not seeing that, whether it's in Nevada, you're not seeing it in Pennsylvania, places that 4 or 8 years ago you would have seen it. And so that, to me, has been more remarkable. And in some ways, Republican down-ballot candidates are more comfortable running with Trump than Democratic down-ballot candidates are right now and running with Biden.
It is remarkable to see that. You bring up Nevada, of course, Sam Brown. Republicans got the person that they wanted there. What do you make of that matchup with Jackie Rosen?
Look, I think the fact is Nevada's probably the blue state that is most vulnerable to becoming a red state. Demographically, it is, you know, it doesn't look like states that Democrats succeed in. Demographically, it looks more like a state. Republicans, more working class voters. It is a diverse state, and that has been, but we know that Republicans are making inroads with working class voters of color. I talked to somebody close to Biden world who said there's two states that keep them up at night. One's Michigan, the other one's Nevada. And I think that, and look, I'm a believer in one of these, that as the presidential goes, so goes these Senate races.
There are also two other states where we're seeing an interesting trend, and that is Ohio and Pennsylvania. In both of those states, we see Senate candidates that are having a bigger lead than President Biden, who is trailing in many ways. What do you make of that trend? What does that say? And do you think it's more likely that Biden sort of catches up with these Senate candidates, or that these Senate candidates get dragged down?
Well, I think, look, let's look at the two unique natures of these Senate candidates, Bob Casey and Sherrod Brown. By the way, they both won their Senate seats the first time in 2006. They have established themselves as not progressive, okay? They've always been hugging, you know, somewhere in between. Sherrod Brown has always been sort of the working class. He's progressive on a few things, but he sort of has his own brand. Casey has his own brand. So I do think you have two incumbents that have their own established brand where they're seen as not Washington Democrats. Now, look, both of their Republican opponents are trying to turn them into Biden Washington Democrats. And I think if they succeed, it could give them both trouble. What's most likely? It's most likely that the Senate candidates fall to Biden rather than Biden rising up to where the Senate candidates are, particularly when you see these are right now. Look, it's good news that Sherrod Brown can run 10 points ahead of Biden. I promise you there's no chance he runs 10 points ahead of him on Election Day. He's got to hope Biden does well enough where running just 5 points ahead of Biden can win him the Senate seat. If he's got to win by run farther ahead, if he's got to run more than 5 points ahead of Biden, I don't think Brown can win. And that's with Casey, we're probably talking in the 2 to 4 point range.
And as we talk about the state of Ohio, that is, there's also the special House election in Ohio. It ended up being closer than expected. What do you take away from that?
This has been a pattern in the Trump era, okay? And part of this is, you know, Republicans, before Donald Trump, Republicans used to overperform in special elections. And it was because they had more, the suburban voter in general is the most common voter to show up. And anywhere, and now that voter, instead of a Republican voter, they're more likely a Democratic voter. Democrats now have the more reliable voters. This is why Democrats want a lower turnout general election. They get a lower turnout general election advantage, Democrats. Right now, the voters who are less engaged, if they do vote, they vote Republican. That's why we've seen this pattern in special elections. I don't know. I would be careful overreading too much. I think this is simply the Democratic voter base is more aware of when elections are than the Republican voter base. That said, I believe that all polling has got, like, everybody was trying to was looking for the missing Trump voter, and now I think everybody might have overcorrected a little bit. So I have a sneaking suspicion that Democrats in general will run somewhere between 1 and 3 points ahead of most of the polling. Now, is 1 to 3 points enough to win? Depends on the state.
Yeah. Well, all interesting things to think about. Thank you so much, Chuck Todd.
Thank you, Yamish.
And still to come, we're live on Capitol Hill as the House just voted to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Moments ago, the House voted to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress, largely along party lines over his refusal to hand over the audio recording of Special Counsel Robert Hur's interview with President Joe Biden. Republicans demanded the audio after Hur declined to prosecute Biden. But the White House asserted executive privilege despite the transcript being available to the public. We should note NBC News is one of several news organizations suing the Justice Department for release of the audio under the Freedom of Information Act. The move by the House today is largely a political exercise. The contempt referral now goes to the Justice Department, but it is extremely unlikely that Merrick Garland will face prosecution. Joining me now from Capitol Hill is NBC News' Ali Vitale. As we mentioned, it's really unlikely that there are going to be legal consequences here for Merrick Garland after this vote. But what are Republicans hoping to gain from all of this?
Yeah, it would be difficult to see prosecutors at the Department of Justice move on prosecuting their boss, effectively, the head of the Department of Justice and the agency. Nevertheless, the House Speaker walked by me just in the last few minutes and told reporters the House did its job tonight on contempt. He thought it was important to lay down this mile marker as House committees continue to press for that audio recording you were just talking about, Yamiche, the audio of Biden's interview with Special Counsel Hur. Of course, it's important to point out that these committees do have the transcripts already. They want the audio because they'd like to go further, get further insight into that. And as you mentioned, we are part of a group of news organizations also pushing for that, for the public interest. Nevertheless, the House doing what it said it would do several weeks ago when these committees voted their contempt resolutions out, putting it on the House floor, and notably, all but one Republican voting to do it.
And as you say that, this all comes as Republicans are grappling with their view of the Justice Department. We saw lawmakers sticking to their claim that there are two systems of justice, even after Hunter Biden, who of course is the son of Joe Biden, was found guilty and had his verdict. Also, the House Oversight Committee, though, is still sending criminal referrals to the Justice Department that they are attacking. So is this message getting muddled here?
That is a muddled message, certainly, as you see those criminal referrals for members of the Biden family being sent out by some of the key committees that have really made it their job to do oversight of the Biden family over the course of the last year plus that they've had the majority of this House. And then at the same time, they are also actively talking about the two-tiered system of justice, the weaponization that they see of government against conservatives. Of course, the fact that Hunter Biden is the son of a Democratic president did nothing to change their view on that. They consistently pointed to the fact that there was initially a sweetheart deal that they, in their words, a sweetheart deal that initially preceded the prosecution that we watched happen this week. Still, we'll see them continue going on. And I think what's important, Yamiche, as I look at the ways that the House Republicans have leveraged their gavel power here, is that they really do view themselves as the immediate line of defense to the former president, who has made a clear decision to go after the role of government, to go after the legal system in this country. And certainly that hasn't changed when you watch the ways that these committees have operated.
Yeah. Well, Ali Vitale, thank you so much for talking all that through for us.
You got it.
And all eyes will remain on Capitol Hill tomorrow as former President Donald Trump is set to meet with congressional Republicans at the Capitol. A Trump campaign official says the meetings are intended to be policy-focused, but the meetings come just after 2 weeks of Trump being found guilty on 34 counts in his New York City hush money case. Joining me now for more on this is, and really all of this from Trump World, is NBC News' Vaughn Hilliard. So, Vaughn, sources tell us tomorrow Trump is set to meet with House Republicans in the morning and then their Senate counterparts in the afternoon. We've seen House Republicans really deliver a more forceful defense of Trump. Do we expect these meetings to differ in tone?
Right, and I think it's notable also, Yamiche, that this is Donald Trump's first trip to the U.S. Capitol since before the January 6, 2021 attack here. And these are two notable meetings. Of course, you have Speaker Johnson, who was asked today about his message to Donald Trump when it comes to the January 6 attack and whether he had confidence that he would oversee a peaceful transfer of power come the end of the 2024 presidential election, to which Johnson responded, of course, he respects that, and we all do. But then you also have Leader McConnell, who, let's also be fair to the Senate Republicans, Yamiche. Each one of them has now lined up alongside Donald Trump here in the 2024 general election, endorsing Donald Trump and indicating that they will, in fact, vote for him. That includes the likes of John Cornyn and John Thune. These are, perhaps some of Republicans who would have liked to have seen a different Republican candidate for president in 2024, yet this is the man, and they are making the conscious decision to welcome him in. And McConnell was asked about January 6th and Donald Trump in his message to him. The two men have not spoken, and he said that he would vowed after the January 6th attack to support whoever the Republican nominee would be in 2024, and he said that he intends to uphold that commitment that he made as the leader of Senate Republicans.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see that meeting and hear about it, since it's been years since McConnell and Trump have seen each other in person. So thank you so much, Vaughn Hilliard, for your reporting.
Thanks, Amish.
And we're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.